Okay, we're going to go live again. Okay, Greg, would you want to?
Why don't you say something?
Yeah, I just want to say for those people who were viewing our first attempt, we're Zoom bombed, and we're now restricting access to this, and we're going to begin again. So I apologize for those disruptions. Okay, Greg.
All right. So I'll be brief at this time. I just wanted to welcome everybody to the conversation again on politics and philosophy of freedom with Richard Dien Winfield, the philosopher running for US Senate. All of the panelists that are talking today with Richard either currently are or were students of Richard in some capacity or another. And the panelists are joining from all over the world. Many of us know each other already personally and professionally. And I want to again publicly thank Sujata for motivating us to put this together. So we'll go ahead and I'll just introduce Richard briefly once more. He's a distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of Georgia in Athens, and he's currently running as a Democrat for a US Senate seat in the state of Georgia in the upcoming special election. And you can visit his website at winfieldforsenate.com for details about his campaign. And one of his most recent books is Democracy Unchained: How We Should Fulfill Our Social Rights and Save Self-Government. Richard, do you want to say anything else to introduce yourself before we go around the room?
I'll just say that, I've spent almost 40 years teaching and writing philosophy. 2 years ago, I decided to take my chances as a candidate for the US House of Representatives in the 10th Congressional District in Georgia. I was defeated in the primary, but I'm back again 2 years later, running for the US Senate in the special election here in Georgia. And I think what I'm experiencing is something that all of us face when we deal with the question of how is one's life as a philosopher connected to one's life as a citizen. And these will be matters we'll be talking about in what follows.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so my name's Greg Moss. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I studied with Richard. He was my doctoral supervisor, graduated in 2014. It was about 6 years ago now. It's hard to believe. I worked at Clemson for a couple of years as a lecturer, and now I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I studied with Richard throughout all my degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. I've written a couple of books, one on Ernst Cassirer, one on Hegel. And now I'm working on the philosophy of mythology, and I'm trying to write a book on Cassirer and Schelling in philosophy of myth. So we'll go around the room. Michael?
Hello, I'm Michael Udenin. I studied with Richard at the University of Georgia. He was my doctoral supervisor. My main interest, philosophical interest, is the philosophy of freedom. I published on the subject, and I work as an engineering manager in San Francisco, California.
Thanks, Michael. Nastasia? You're muted, sorry.
Yes, thanks. So first I would like to thank Greg for putting the event together. I would like to also thank and recognize the support of Sujata Winfield. She has always welcomed us very kindly, and I see her as this strong and tireless force walking always alongside Richard. So thanks, Sujata. And I would also like to start by publicly saying that I'm proud of Dr. Winfield for deciding to take this courageous step towards fuller citizenship by running for Senate. And I also see it as a courageous step towards philosophy as well. It's a real act of courage to put one's philosophical ideas to test. I'm Nastasia Pugliese. I am professor of philosophy at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I work at the College of Education and at the philosophy department with early modern philosophy. contemporary philosophy of education, and I'm currently involved in various projects on the retrieval of the works of women philosophers of the past. I was Richard's student during my PhD at the University of Georgia. Then I came back to Brazil, started a postdoc, and now I'm working at the UFRJ. So thank you again for this invitation. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Richard.
Emery, would you say a word?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Emre. I live in Berlin with my wife and son. I completed the PhD program in philosophy at the University of Georgia in 2017. I wrote my dissertation on Hegel's idea of life in his system of logic and in his philosophy of nature under the supervision of Dr. Winfield. Currently, I continue to do independent research on the systematic connections between different domains of philosophy, drawing mostly upon Hegel's system of philosophy.
Thanks, Emery. Joey, you say a few words?
Sure. I'm Joey Carter. I still live in Athens, Georgia. I finished my dissertation on Aristotle physics with Richard. While my dissertation explores the connection between Aristotle's concept of motion and the infinite in the physical world, I now do something completely different. Apart from the academy, I'm a labor and community organizer here in Athens, and helped found the first public sector union here in the state of Georgia called the United Campus Works of Georgia. And this is very important because Richard is one of our key members, and his part of his platform, a major part of his platform, and his philosophical grounding has to do with what freedom means with respect to labor. And that's something that I'm particularly interested to hear and talk about today.
Thanks, Joey. Brooke?
I'm Brooke Rudeau. I am also a former student of Dr. Winfield from the University of Georgia. I'm currently a lecturer at Georgia College and State University. My work tends to center on environmental philosophy and philosophy of technology and some social epistemology, though I do step outside of that from time to time. My dissertation was focused on building an environmental ethic on the basis of a particular conception of home. And I still work a little bit in that area.
Thanks, Brooke. Army?
My name is Irami Yosef Frimpong, and I currently study with Richard Dien Winfield at the University of Georgia. And I came here because I suspected that a lot of our problems came with a misconception, and now I'm even more convinced that so many of our problems are the result of an underdeveloped notion of freedom that we all labor under, and they won't be solved until we actually fill out and develop a more robust notion of what a free society looks like in both the family life and civil society and even our political infrastructure. And without that understanding, I think we're just kind of flailing for another 100 years.
Thank you, Army. Okay, so we've introduced all the panelists, and now Richard, the floor is yours to give us a short presentation. And then after that, we'll open up the floor to questions and discussion. Okay, so it's all yours.
Okay, I just wanted to begin by noting that there is a stark difference between being a philosopher or engaging in philosophical inquiry and engaging in political activity. There are some within the ranks of philosophy who would dispute that by suggesting that, as Marx would do in his thesis on Feuerbach, that the task of philosophy is not to understand what is, but to change the world. As if philosophical activity from the outset is guided by a practical end to which it is subservient. But if that were the case, that very end would be outside of philosophical investigation. And it would be simply established as a dogmatic assumption about which philosophy could shed no light. What alone gives philosophy its special rank as an instrument of truth is precisely that it is not subservient to any dogmas and questions everything as, in a sense, a preface to being able to think the truth by relying on reason. Now, I think you see that distinction drawn between the activity of philosophy and political activity in the plight of Socrates at his trial as depicted in the Apology, where Socrates is someone who is devoted to the quest for truth. I mean, he's at that point of bringing people to engage in that quest, which requires that you call into question all your assumptions, all your dogmas, and come to an awareness of your own ignorance. And those who become aware of their own ignorance end up becoming little Socrates who question others, and in that respect become a threat to those who hold authority on the basis of expertise that they really may not be able to justify. Now, in his defense, Socrates has to ensure that justice be done, that what is right is done. And that is not the same thing as uncovering the truth, because you have to persuade individuals to act in accord with what's right. And although you might use reason to convince them of what is right, that doesn't mean that they will choose to do what is right. And for that reason, you may have to appeal to other kinds of motivations between the motivation of acting in accord with what reason tells us is just. Now, I think that distinction between what it means to engage in you could say, practical activities in the highest sense of what is ethical, as opposed to the pure theorizing of philosophy, is brought into play also in another early writing of Plato, in Meno, where he points out that our most illustrious political leaders need not have philosophical wisdom. In fact, it appears they don't have philosophical wisdom. All they seem to have is right opinion. They end up doing what is right, but they're not able to know that it is right. And we see that in their inability to teach others what is the good. But as Socrates notes in that same dialogue, having right opinion is not as good as having true knowledge, which philosophy can provide. Because if you have right opinion, it's not tied down. You can easily lose it. Why? Because you don't know why the right opinion is true. And that might shed some light on why in Plato's perhaps greatest work, The Republic, Socrates will tell his fellow discussants that, frankly, the shortest way to ensure that we have justice, that we have a community that is in accord with what is good, is if philosophers come to rule or rulers become philosophers. But there is, of course, a catch, because when the philosopher turns away from conceiving the truths that are available to reason, the philosopher has to deal with the nitty-gritty of the actual world. You have to concern yourself with something Aristotle spoke of when he pointed out that it's one thing to conceive what is the best state, what is the ideal state, the ideal society, etc., and conceiving what is the best community that we are able to erect under current conditions. Well, in a sense, that I think gives a clue that when you turn to the domain of action, you indeed can be guided by philosophical principle, but you have to take into account what are the given state of affairs, what are the real possibilities that are available in what is actual, and as part of those possibilities, what is it that you have to do in order to gain support for what can be enacted? And all of what's involved in figuring that out, which might be tantamount to figuring out what a viable political agenda should be, is something that may be informed by a recognition of what's right, that philosophy might aspire to provide. But it requires engaging in a study of actual conditions that can't rely on reason alone. It requires immersing oneself in the facts. And then, of course, there's a third activity that gets involved. You may have been able to work out the policies that are feasible and that are what can best realize what is right. But then you have to figure out how to get them enacted and to be part of that endeavor. So there are really these three activities that might be thought of as what one would want to engage in if one is to recognize that there is a role of philosophy, at least in giving us a sense of what are the principles of right, of justice, etc. But then there's another activity of figuring out the policies that fit the world as we find it, and that are, in a sense, an agenda for how we can transform the world, given what it is. And then there's that third task of actually fighting to bring those matters about. Now, admittedly, we are all finite human beings. We have a limited lifespan. The task of philosophizing is not equivalent to being someone who can strut around full of wisdom. You may have achieved some wisdom through your philosophical investigation, but you are still on the prowl. You are still searching. Otherwise, your activity as a philosopher has come to an end. And it's obviously something that consumes a lifetime, if not more than a lifetime. On the other hand, the very task of working out policy, of dealing with the state of affairs that there are, is also an extremely consuming matter. And likewise, the activity of someone who is going to be putting into practice and gaining the support, which may require different things depending upon the kind of political order one is in. Each of these three separate activities can be regarded as an all-consuming activity. And that could suggest, we're really speaking about a division of labor between three different classes of people. The philosopher, who may deliver the conception of what is right. The sort of, you might call them, as they did in Russia, the intelligentsia, or those who are going to be working in this kind of empirical study informed by philosophical principle of what we have to do. And then the actual, call them politicians, who are going to fight to bring these into reality under the circumstances that there are. And if you were to be a philosopher who wanted to engage in politics, to some degree, you have to face up to the fact that while you're engaged in these other activities, if you take them up, you can't do everything at once. You can't continue really with your philosophical work. Now, of course, you might want to make a certain kind of compromise and be what is sometimes called a public intellectual. For example, I had the good fortune to have a Zoom discussion with Noam Chomsky, who is one of our most prominent public intellectuals. And of course, he's someone who speaks about our current state of affairs. And he does this while he has retained his academic activity, some of which is philosophical, some of which is linguistic in a non-philosophical character. But of course, the public intellectual risks the problem of being within this ghetto of people of letters. You may get your things published in the New York Review of Books or its equivalent, but that's not a matter of really taking hold of political reality. So in a sense, if you are going to indulge in politics, and you're doing it in a democratic situation, or at least in a body politic that involves gaining electoral office as a pathway to making the changes that philosophy might lead you to after you've informed yourself of what the state of affairs is. you have to really spend your time immersing yourself in the facts, working out a political program, and then taking the step, which could be regarded as equally all-consuming, of engaging in political life. Now, that's not to say that philosophy has not had I think, a fundamental bearing upon where we are. Because one way of looking at our current predicament is to say that, look, here in the modern world, an agenda has come into place which regards freedom as a center point of what makes life worth living. That we think in terms of an opposition between freedom and oppression. Of course, there are competing visions of what freedom is. But this enterprise of trying to create institutions of freedom is obviously contested. After all, the modern times is a slaughterhouse in which we have various versions of the pursuit of freedom going against various movements that contest the legitimacy of freedom. Some involve making appeal to traditions that want to have life governed by relationships that are not founded in self-determination, but in norms that could be said to be given by tradition, that could be thought of as being mandated by religious dogma, where instead of engaging in self-determination, we regard what we should do as being determined by a transcendent being who might be regarded as the one and only lawmaker. As Osama bin Laden would instruct Americans in his letter to America, how dare you have the presumption that you can make laws of your own. The only laws are those that come from God. And our task is to submit to those laws, which obviously means having a view of what is right that does not accept the idea that self-determination is the anchor of where we must go. And then, of course, you have another view, which might even be looked upon as not appealing to pre-modern traditions, if modernity is to be identified with the project in a normative sense, the project of founding institutions of freedom, but something that might be considered postmodern, a fascist movement, which we see gaining ground both in the United States and internationally, that wants to regard the particularity of some group that could be based on ancestry as giving it an unchallenged preeminence, whereby it should assert itself and dominate everything else, and in that way offer a challenge equally to freedom. Now, there is a philosophical tradition that I think we see at play in this situation in the United States that presents us with in a way, our point of departure. And I think it applies to many other countries as well. And you see it embodied in the most famous words of the Declaration of Independence, that we take these truths to be self-evident, that we are all created equal with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government is to be instituted in order to uphold these inalienable rights. This is obviously a view that is guided by the social contract tradition, which takes freedom as a principle. That is, it takes freedom as something given, and thereby, one might say, something that is by nature, and to which legitimate institutions are to be sanctioned to the extent that they uphold that freedom that is given prior to and apart from them. And if we think through the logic of this project, which has been thought through by a whole slew of early modern Western philosophers, including Spinoza, Hobbes, Locke, Kant, and others, Rousseau, it turns out we end up with a kind of body politic where property rights are held to be of key importance, and the task of the state essentially consists in upholding person and property with the consent of the governed. And I think the most consistent thinkers of that tradition recognize that protecting liberty is not equivalent to providing for self-government. As Locke and Hobbes recognize, you can't have a government that's led by a monarch or a oligarchy that does not involve representational self-government, which can uphold person and property with the consent of the governed. And in this framework where legitimate institutions are regarded as instruments for protecting a type of freedom that can be found independent of them and prior to them, there's always a problem that the institutions that are called upon may not do what they're called upon to do because they are means to an end. They are different from the end. And therefore, not only might there be other means to fulfilling that end, but the means might not automatically fulfill the end. And that comes up as this question of how can we secure that our government is going to uphold the rights? Do we have to accept the idea that it always does what's right because we've authorized it, as people like Hobbes and Rousseau will sometimes say, or do we take Locke's view, that we have a right to judge whether we should subscribe to its edicts by using our own judgment, which then seems to corrupt the whole authority of this. Now, if you look at our Constitution, in a way, it's also informed by that framework because our Constitution says very little about anything other than our person and property, the legal procedures that uphold our person and property, and a form of representation, of representative government. It says nothing about our other freedoms, the freedoms that involve a family that is constituted as an institution of freedom, in which spouses co-determine their common private domain, or alternately a free society in which our social and economic rights are upheld. All of these are ignored by our Constitution. And I think we all know that the history of our republic has been one in which the limited rights that are in our Constitution originally were only applied to white men who were heterosexual and had a certain amount of property. We've had waves of civil rights struggles to try to make these rights apply to everyone. But at every moment of triumph, it's also been recognized that when these rights have been more consistently realized, that has not eliminated tremendous barriers of opportunity in the family and in society that not only obstruct freedom in those domains, but obstruct equal political participation. And that's been recognized in the 20th century, for example, by FDR when he called for a new Bill of Rights, and by Martin Luther King, who after all the achievements of the civil rights movement, put out his call for a poor people's campaign, which was grounded on an agenda of fulfilling these rights that are not specified in our Constitution. Now, philosophy can play a role here in examining the recipe for freedom that is offered by the social contract tradition, and which in a way finds its extreme personification in the minimal state, or what has come to be called, the type of economic liberalism that really wants to ensure that the state does nothing at all other than protect person and property, and avoids any concern for household and social opportunity. Well, we are in a position to think through the relationship of different kinds of freedom. And we can think conceptually, without even having to observe anything, what it means to participate in self-government can't possibly take place unless citizens are also free of domination in society and in the household. Because if relations of domination prevail in those domains, they quite obviously obstruct equal political participation. So one can have a certain grounding in a richer view of freedom, which I myself find presented and pioneered by Hegel, although in an incomplete way. And that, in a sense, provides a basis for an agenda to, let's say, perfect what could be considered an incomplete constitution, because constitutions, after all, should be upholding all of our rights to ensure that they can't be violated with impunity. So that's one way in which a certain philosophical view can try to enter into the fray. Now, I might note that the very possibility of philosophy being able to tell us anything about what's right is called into question by much of those who occupy positions in the philosophical academy today, and in fact, the most powerful positions. One brand of this is represented by people who take the liberal framework, but treat it in a kind of historicist way, where they say, okay, we're not going to say, as Hobbes and Locke and Spinoza and others thought, that the social contract vision is something dictated by reason. They want to rather say, reason can't really tell us what we ought to do, but the most we can do is reflect on our common moral intuitions and engage in what someone like Rawls will call reflective equilibrium. And say, okay, we all appear to be committed to this idea of liberty and self-ownership, etc. So let's try to think through a way of working out what it would consistently amount to. Now, alas, it's not only questionable that we all have common moral intuitions, but it's quite obvious today that we are in a world where more and more that alleged consensus is challenged, and challenged in the most radical way. Challenged, as I mentioned, by Islamist fundamentalists, who, in the extreme example of ISIS, for example, reinstituted slavery and all forms of domination under the banner of theocracy. And of course, it is challenged by fascist movements. We may have defeated the greatest fascist movement in World War II, but fascism is raising its head again in this country and in almost every other democratic nation. And that means, in a way, there's a call for philosophy to do what an appeal to common intuitions can't do. Because we can't take freedom as an assumption, as a dogma, and presume that we're all committed to freedom and regarding freedom as an ultimate value and democracy as an ultimate value, because we are in a world where that is not the case and has never been the case. So there is a need to be able to justify freedom as well as what it is philosophically. Now, in doing that, one has to come up against a strain within philosophy that also has a very important presence in the academy. And that's the kind of philosophy that I think was pioneered by Nietzsche and is taken up by postmodernists. And it takes the following view. It regards basically all the activities that we think of as pertaining to reason, that is the quest for truth, the quest to figure out what is right, to do what's right, as all involving engagements where reason is really not able to provide answers to what is right, because reason always has to begin with a foundation of some sort or other. A foundation like the principle of liberty that social contract theory begins with, or a highest good that Aristotle will begin with. But to the extent that we begin with foundations, we're beginning with something that can't be justified in and of itself. But theorizing, as well as any appeal to what is right, always proceeds from foundations. They're not given with any necessity. They're arbitrary. And that means what we have to do is recognize that they are impositions of a notion of value, that as a value is supposed to apply to all, but they're really emanating from a certain agent in virtue of, in a sense, what they are in terms of their own particularity, because there's nothing universal about these values. And that therefore, rationality, as we think of it, is really nothing more than a will to power. Will to power where people are advancing values that they purport to be universal. They're coming from something that is not founded in reason or nature. It's simply particular and arbitrary. And in this regard, all the aspirations of democracy are really coming from a particular type of agency that is attempting to assert itself. And this view, as Nietzsche will put it forward, will say the only way of being consistent with the will to power is to engage in the will to power without making any bones about it, without pretending that you're putting forward values that are universal or grounded in reason. You're instead asserting your own particular vantage point, imposing it on everyone else, and recognizing it's particular and subordinating everyone else to you. And in a way, that is a kind of justification for what fascism is doing. Now, the problem is that that whole enterprise undercuts its own authority, because by treating reason as being always foundational or conditioned, its very own diagnosis of reason is something that lacks authority. It's just an arbitrary stipulation. And that means that there is a way forward for reason if reason can operate without foundations. And in a sense, the very autonomy of philosophy that philosophers have always aspired to provides a kind of positive counterpoint to this. That is, we have to engage in a thinking that is autonomous, that is not grounded in any authority, where we are completely responsible for whatever we come up with. Otherwise, everything we do is relative to the starting points we begin with and conditioned. We can engage in an unconditioned thinking. We have to get at truth. And there's nothing about our finite being that prevents us from doing so. And the same thing applies to practice. This is what would give authority to self-determination as something that is understood as what is, in virtue of determining itself to be what it is. Not having a given character, not being a foundation, not being a principle. So this is a kind of a recipe that philosophy could give us for how we can stand with a certain amount of certainty in defense of a project of realizing self-determination as best as it can in the world we face. So what do we face here in the United States? I would maintain we're not facing a revolutionary situation. We're facing a situation of reform, because we have a constitution that to some degree honors freedom, albeit in a somewhat defective form, as something given by nature, as a kind of liberty. But we can complete the edifice of freedom. We can add to our constitution the rights that have been ignored. And that's sort of the thrust of the campaign I've been involved in. Admittedly, facing all the limitations that one faces by going into a political sphere, where one's access to the public is dependent under current conditions in America on how many resources you have, which means how much money you have access to, and where you can't depend on the press to cover all candidates by any means. So I'll leave what I have to say at this, and I'd be happy to hear what the rest of you think.
Thank you, Richard, for your presentation. And many of us have heard aspects of this before, if not the whole thing. We appreciate you giving us the talk. I think just to keep things smooth and to make sure we're not talking over each other, if someone has a question, could you just send me your name in the chat box, and then I can call on each of you in the order that your name appears in the chat box, and then we can just go down like that. Yeah, I hope that's okay with everybody as a kind of procedure for the discussion. So yeah, you can either send me your name. Okay. Oh yeah, there's also the raise hand feature, which you can also use. Thanks, Emre. So perhaps we can also use the raise hand feature as well. And I'll try to keep track of the questions. Who would like to begin? Okay. Okay. Army, would you like to begin? Please.
All right, so I'm trying to figure out the characteristic difference between weaning Americans off of King George and, you know, being kind of under his capricious desires and that kind of tyranny versus the situation where we're trying to wean Americans off of the notion that freedom is a principle of nature. If one was a revolutionary position and needed like the realization of a revolution, how come the other is just a matter of reform, since they're both fundamentally and deeply and structurally inadequate?
I mean, if you think about the sense in which the American Revolution was revolutionary, it did involve having to make use of extra parliamentary means in order to achieve its ends, and basically escape, you could say, colonization to the British Empire. And in doing that, it did involve a certain degree of social transformation, because the new republic was a republic. It ended titles. It ended these kind of pre-modern holdovers of estates, of nobility and the like, of the distinction between nobles and others that held true in Britain, as well as having an official religion, as the Church of England had a kind of exclusive prominence in Great Britain. So you had these kind of transformations that took place, but otherwise, the other forms of social relations, including patriarchy, including a failure to fulfill the social rights of individuals, including the abolition of slavery, of course, these things did not occur. Now, of course, there was a war to eliminate slavery, or that ended up eliminating slavery, but the rest of the social agenda, social rights agenda, right, has not been achieved. But the question is, can one achieve it through electoral means? Or is there really a viable option that does not rely upon electoral means and that amounts to either electing a legislature that is willing to enact positive laws, or ultimately getting support to add to the Constitution certain constitutional amendments that will do the job? I think those are two avenues that are possible. I think the quest for doing it in other ways is not either viable or necessarily a way of doing things that could be counted on and leading to the results one wants. So I think that's sort of the situation we are at. We're not in a situation, as you might say the colonies were, where there was a power outside ourselves that was imposing limitations upon how we organize ourselves. We're not in that position, and in a sense, we are privileged in being, a military power that has no real threats of foreign military occupation, and we have, a gigantic economy which is sufficient to allow us to escape economic pressures from abroad that will dictate what we do. We have all the resources. It's a question of political will, where we go.
Can I follow up?
Yeah, please,
Yeah.
first.
But there was a way in which prior to the Civil War, we were also not under the auspices of a power outside of ourselves. But the reformist measures to go from, slavery to non-slavery weren't going to happen through the legislature. And that's how you got the, Missouri Compromise and other fundamentally inadequate solutions. So at first I thought the difference between power outside of ourselves versus unharnessed power within ourselves was a good argument. But then I thought of, prior to the Civil War.
Well, look, it's always possible for a nation to divulge into factions that are simply unwilling to abide by the common political options of, let's say, parliamentary government. And it can divulge into civil war. And then we're in a different situation. Then we're in a situation where it's not a matter of discourse, but a matter of force, which will alter the situation. But of course, when the war is over, then you still have to go back. I mean, think of what happened in our situation. We had the Civil War. It overthrew a certain regime. But then the question is, what could it do next? This also is similar to the situation when you think about regime change in general. Because admittedly, you can, from outside, topple a regime that can be considered to be oppressive. But the nature of the institutions of freedom is that they have a reality insofar as a prevailing segment of the population is willing to participate in them and recognize them. And that can happen very rapidly, as we saw after World War II, when we had occupations of Japan and at least West Germany. And very quickly, they ended up adopting and participating in institutions of freedom that, in a sense, were more liberated than either any part of Germany or Japan had ever engaged in. But that is not something that can be managed simply from without. It depends on the initiative of those who are within.
Yeah, and I will say that with the Civil War, we did succeed in losing the peace, and that's why, like, we had the war, but we didn't actually have the program to change the consciousness.
Now, of course,
the electorate.
things might have been different if, for example, force had been maintained for a certain period of time. Namely, the Union Army had remained occupying the South to ensure that Reconstruction could operate, and to contend with the force that was being used by basically the Confederate loyalists.
Or we could have taken the cultural
Throughout their
program.
journey.
Or we could have taken the cultural program more seriously. I feel like that's where we lost.
But I think there was, I mean, the problem was there was active terror being perpetrated on a mass scale that really required some kind of, I think, martial resistance. And that was the situation. There was a breakdown, in other words, of ordinary political activity. Now, we could face that here, and of course, things are different in various countries. I mean, Brazil may be in a similar situation to we are, maybe more extreme, maybe not, with Bolsonaro and Trump, both not particularly willing to give up power. Bolsonaro simply sometimes talking about reverting to military rule, military dictatorship, right? So these present us with different kinds of political options.
Okay, thanks, guys. I'm going to go ahead. Emre had a question.
Okay, thank you. This is a clear follow-up, but also a kind of step back from the history and maybe an inquiry into the general characteristics of struggle, I would say. So one of the essential tenets of your philosophy and also Hegel's philosophy is that self-determination is foundation-free. So normative character of political self-determination is foundation-free. The validity or invalidity of a political system cannot be determined from without. And it's all about whether the constituting institutions are working in a way that will realize and guarantee political self-determination. Of course, how these institutions operate is bound up with the character of the Constitution, but as you argue, the founding of the Constitution can occur in manifold ways, and these ways themselves need not consist in the act of self-determination. But still, there is this path to self-determination, and there are people fighting for their freedom. So my question is about whether there is a domain of normativity that concerns the struggle for self-determination. Are there valid or invalid forms of struggle, or is it a matter of pragmatics, just some kind of a will to power? And to what extent your answer would address cases such as the US, where there is a constitution, there's a system of right, but it's flawed and incomplete, as you say. There are institutions that are manipulated, or basic prerequisites of self-determination that are only in the service of a few. So how do you decide whether the struggle is bound by the normativity of self-determination itself, or begins to fall out of this domain?
Well, I think you could contrast the situation I think that I am in and that my fellow Americans are in with the situation of founders of a constitution. You know, if you're founders of a constitution, however you found it, you are bringing into being something that does not yet exist. So you are engaged in an activity of making, in a way, where the activity you engage in is not part of what you are bringing into being. And in that regard, it's not really a self-determining activity, because it's producing something separate from the activity it's engaged in. Whereas, you know, when you're living within the fabric of self-determined agencies, of institutions, you are engaged in various types of self-determination, political self-determination, social determination, family determination, etc., in which your activity is actually contained within the workings of that framework within which you operate. So your activity is not really separate from what it is you are producing. You know, you're sort of acting upon your own activity in a way, which is in a way what it means to be self-determining. when you're in a situation of founding a constitution, you're in what could be considered a kind of moral situation, where morality can be looked at in contrast to the kind of self-determinations that pertain to being a member of a community that is ethical, where activities consist in occupying roles that have the character of perpetuating that community, and where the freedoms you are able to exercise as members of that community are the very freedoms in which the life of that community consists. So that representative government or democracy, for example, exists in nothing other than the activities of the exercise of political freedom of the members, of the citizens. But when you're acting to produce a just body politic, which as such has to have a constitutional order so that rights are respected and the like, you're engaged in what could be considered a moral activity, where morality is something where you're engaged in a practice where what is right is something that does not yet exist. And its coming into existence depends upon your initiative. And there are no accepted ground rules that guide what you're doing. It's up to you, or you might say us, as revolutionary subjects or whatever, to figure out what is it that we have to do. Because we're not acting constitutionally, for example. There is no order that has any objective legitimacy, whose rules and laws we are following. We're in a situation where that situation is precisely what we're attempting to bring into being. And I think that's the situation one is in as a founder. Whereas when you're within a constitutional order that is not, let's say, complete or imperfect, you're modifying it as opposed to replacing it. And that allows you to make use of the freedoms you have within that order to perfect it. And I think that's the situation you're in as a reformer, as opposed to being in the situation of a revolutionary. Now, of course, you have to judge what situation are we in. And obviously it varies. You may not be in a situation where you have the opportunity to make the transformations as required. And by the same token, the same thing applies, for example, in religion, where religions themselves can undergo various kinds of reforms. The question is, can you reform a religion and a religious tradition in a way that allows you to make it satisfactory and still retain its identity? Or do you need to break with that religion and found another? You have to leave Judaism behind and found Christianity, etc. Right? Well, here, of course, we're speaking with regard to a cultural entity, but within our situation where politics presides over all of our other spheres, there are these two different situations. And then, as Irene has pointed out, the order you belong to may break down. And Lincoln spoke of what was established through the Civil War as a new birth of freedom. Well, it was to some degree a new birth of freedom, not a complete new birth not a birth of a complete freedom, but a partial achievement. And note that it took place both through the crucible of war and also through the enactment of constitutional amendments and laws. Of course, both were flaunted in much of the country afterwards, and were not reinstated until not that long ago.
Thanks. Joey, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I want to shift this a little bit. Richard, you talked about earlier the difference between a philosopher who simply philosophizes and the one who engages in politics. One of the things that often goes overlooked in the Republic is how the philosopher king and reason, how it does ultimately fail. and it fails by contradiction. The definition of justice is to do one's own activity, is to mind one. So the job of the craftsman, the job of the normal citizen is to engage in their activity that is dictated by nature. And the same with the guardian is to operate according to their nature, and not to engage in another activity. And reason is bound by this as well. And so the activity of reason, the activity of the philosopher king, is to order the whole, is to order the whole city, to order the whole body, to order the whole soul. The problem that Plato is not so explicit about is that in order for reason to order the whole soul, or for the philosopher to order the entire city, is that it has to know what each is doing in order to organize it. But one of the principles of knowing for Plato, and pretty much for every Greek thinker, is to be that thing. So in order for reason to know how to order the whole soul, it in a way has to be each part. But this in a way ends up being a contradiction. It ends up being a kind of injustice, because it has to be each other part in a way. And the reason I bring this up is that the failure, I think, for Plato is rather intentional. It's to redirect of how the philosopher goes back down the cave. It doesn't stay in the realm of the good. It doesn't stay outside of the cave. It goes back into the cave, not just to help people ask questions, but to order everything is to be a kind of organizer. Now, Plato was not a political organizer, but I am. And that's the way that I think in terms of the agendas that we have on the table as political goals, whether that's reform or revolution, has to center the ways that we go about organizing our families, our jobs, our churches, our governments. And so the philosopher has to think as an organizer. And so it can't stay in the realm of the forms. It can't stay in academia. And so this question is both one of how do we as philosophers critique our own amongst each other, instead of staying in the academy, staying in our offices, staying where we're safe and taking risks, to engage in political organizing, to engage in organizing. And so that's more of how to think internally of us as philosophers. How do we become organizers? And then once we are organizing, what are the things that change from being a philosopher who engages in the thinking to the philosopher who organizes on the ground, where all the mess is, where all the complications are, where you have to work with all sorts of different people and all sorts of different activities. So that's my question.
I mean, your question, refers to various aspects of the discussion in the Republic, and I think throughout ancient Greek philosophy, where there's a kind of both refusal and denial that it's possible to think self-determination. And you find this explicitly laid out in the Republic, where Socrates is considering self-control. And he points out that, the whole idea of self-control isn't coherent, because how can the same agent both be what you might say organizes and is organized, that which controls and is controlled? it seems to be contradictory. And Socrates regards it as being unthinkable because it is contradictory. And therefore he says, we have to think of both the soul and the body politic as divided into a ruling agent and a subject that is acted upon and organized by the ruler. And that allows us to think of what's going on in politics as if it were a kind of craft, where the activity of the craft or the artisan is to impose form upon something, some given material, separate from itself, and where the act it engages in is not contained in what it imposes form upon, but is an act that gets extinguished by producing the organized entity. Now, the catch is that when we're dealing with a political community, the ruler is part of that political community. The order that is imposed on the body politic is an order that the ruling agency imposes upon itself. It can't help but end up involving a certain aspect of self-determination. And that involves this kind of reflexivity, in the sense that what rules and is ruled is one and the same. And that's what it means to speak of self-government. Now, the Greeks have problems with this. Even Aristotle, when he speaks about how citizens proper should all have the ability to engage in ruling, he only allows that to happen where people alternate in occupying the ruling position. And there's only a certain group that are rulers and the others are subservient to them. And of course, that's reflected in how there are different classes of individuals who are excluded from engagement in politics. But if we regard self-determination as of ultimate value and regard how the self-determined body politic involves somehow an identity between ruler and ruled, we're in a different situation. And that does not mean that we're talking about participatory democracy, because the argument for participatory democracy usually wants to say, following Rousseau, that if you have a representative, the decision made by the representative is not your decision. You've forsaken your freedom. We only have real freedom in a political sense when the universal will, namely what the state does, is identical with what you choose as a citizen. But that can only be the case if there's unanimity. Rousseau sort of recognizes that. He bans all parties, all bases of any different kinds of interests, and ultimately recognizes it. If participatory rule is going to allow for there to be this identity of what the state decides and what the individual chooses, all citizens must be one. They must choose as one. We must eliminate political plurality. And the other catch, of course, with participatory democracy, to the extent that it's a full-time activity or an important activity, it can only be occupied by those who are not doing the other things that are needed. So we have to have people excluded from political activity who take care of households and the economy. But if we're going to talk about self-government, we have to have representation, but representation cannot be operated in the way I see many of my colleagues on the campaign trail operate. They're often thinking about representation as a senator or as a member of the House of Representatives, as what you're doing is you're representing the interests of either your congressional district or of Georgians, of the people in Georgia. That's what you're going to Washington to do. You're to represent their interests and make them prevail over the interests of everyone else. Now that's how democracy turns into a battle of factions for domination over one another. And you no longer have self-rule. You have those who are able to get their will through acting on everyone else. But the way in which you are a legitimate representative, as a senator or as a congressperson, as someone in the House, you are there to present a vision for how all the freedoms of everyone in America are to be fulfilled. And if the people vote for you, you are representing their political vision for how, in a sense, the common good, not how their interests are to prevail over the interests of others. And I think it's that way of recognizing that politics is always about the universal, that allows it to have the reflexivity that ensures the rulers and the ruled can be regarded as one and the same, as political self-determination requires. And that was something the Greeks have problems dealing with. Now, by the way, there's one other thing I want to say a moment in regard to the role of, let's say, a philosopher in playing any any role in trying to get one's fellow citizens to do what is right. And of course, that's not just a philosophical matter. It's a matter of working out policies based upon philosophical principle. But some of you have managed to get a career in academia. And I suspect you're going to experience something that I've found in my 4 decades of teaching. And that is, I have never been able to change the thinking of any of my colleagues or pretty much anyone I meet in academic conferences. The only people whose thinking I have any impact upon are students. And why is that? Well, I think there are 2 factors. One, of course, is you're coming to school, you're open, right? Or hopefully you're open. You're there because you recognize you don't know what you should know. There are things you haven't figured out. Academics may, on the other hand, have a certain degree of contentment with what they thought through. But on the other hand, I don't have any sustained contact with them in terms of presenting my ideas to them. I mean, your colleagues, when you come up for tenure and review, they never read your material to any great extent, especially if you have a lot of material. They may hear a couple of papers, once a year or more than a year, but that's about it. Whereas a student has a very sustained contact with you. You really have a chance to present arguments at length. And you can sort of think of the following. Aristotle was in a position where you might say he was trying to get the ear of a ruler. The ruler was Alexander the Great. And he was the teacher of Alexander. He had sustained connection with Alexander. He could influence his thinking potentially. Now, you might ask yourself, what can you do in a democracy? And I have to say, from my experience on the campaign trail, the opportunity to make arguments to the public is very limited. It's first of all very limited because you don't have the resources to get your message out in detail to everyone. You don't have access to the press. The press isn't interested in looking at things in any detail. If you have a ton of money, you can get sound bites on the airwaves, on the media. If you go to meetings to speak to the small group of people you encounter at a meeting of the local Democrats or a Chamber of Commerce or whatever, you don't have very much time, and you're probably never going to see these people again. So people give the same stump speech over ad nauseum. In most cases, they don't even bother speaking about policies or trying to convince anyone of anything. They tell them about their own identity and the like. So it's a difficult situation, when you're trying to make a case and transform the thinking. But unfortunately, that's a framework one finds oneself in. Now, I know I skirted around a lot of things. I didn't directly.
Joey, yes.
No,
Follow up?
I want to briefly ask this as a challenge, because just for full disclosure, you have me as a materialist asking you a question where my expectations are very different.
Yeah.
And so is political organizing really about the universal? It may ultimately be, but on the ground, are you operating simply in terms of the universal? When I go into a workplace and I'm organizing my workers, or I go, I'm asking them questions of what their conditions are. I want to know what, or if I go into a community, I want to know what their living conditions are. If I'm organizing around anti-eviction, I want to know what the landlord is doing, what that particular landlord is doing. If political organizing is operating on a principle of you as a candidate organizing around an idea that in terms of self-determination is self-imposed, where the hell do you get it? There's something still, you're still operating phenomenologically with a given, with some kind of conditions on the ground. And so I don't entirely agree that that the political is about the universal. It may ultimately be, but in terms of being on the ground and doing the organizing, you may find through time and through talking to people that there are general things to organize around, but where do you, you're still, and so my point is, you're still operating with a given, you're still operating with a set of conditions that are given. And how do you continue to move in the direction toward a universal, a good, when we still don't even have a good handle on what the conditions that need to be addressed are? In terms of making a movement in our country toward a leftist kind of politics, or whatever you want to call it, in that direction.
Well, I think it's very important to distinguish between the kind of organizing you're speaking about, which is really social organizing, labor organizing, tenant organizing, where one is concerned with social interests, particular interests, not universal, because there are no interests that are universal in when we're dealing with social interaction. Marx in his young days might have thought that the proletariat had a universal interest. That was based upon the idea that the proletariat was utterly propertyless. It sold itself in actually wage slavery to the employer. It had no stake in civil society. Its interests consist in overthrowing the totality, negating civil society in its whole. But later in Capital, he recognized that actually employees have property. They own themselves, and they can sell for a limited period of time their capacity to work. But you have to recognize there's a fundamental distinction that I think Hegel is the first philosopher to clearly draw between a free society and a free political domain, a civil society versus a political domain. A civil society is that domain in which individuals exercise their right to pursue particular interests, but those particular interests have to be of such a character that they enable others to pursue self-selected particular interests of their own. Now, we, of course, live in a civil society where that kind of freedom of interest is obstructed, and it's obstructed to the extent that we allow the market to operate in a way which allows inherent imbalances in the relation between employer and employee to perpetuate themselves, so that the interest of employers predominates over the interests of employees. And that also applies to the relation of landlords over the relations of tenants, et cetera. And if one wants to uphold what could be considered equal social opportunity, it's a matter of, shall we say, restoring the balance or evening the playing field between all of these interests. Now, that's different, again, from politics, which is concerned with ordering the whole. That's why when we talk about, for example, governance of an enterprise, sometimes people will put forward the idea of employee self-management. Others, like myself, put forward the idea of having corporate boards have equal representation between employees and employers. Some people want to say, well, that's something akin to democracy. That's the democratization of the economy, or that's something political. Well, it's not political, because it's concerned with the particular interests of the participants of an enterprise. And that's not the interest, that's not the common interest or the common good. Now, politics can be deformed by political players operating to take hold of the state in order to serve a particular interest. And you find that sanctioned when you allow political parties to organize themselves on the basis of a particular interest, such as parties that are organized in terms of a particular religious identity, racial identity, it could be gender identity, class identity. In each case, you undercut self-government and the reflexivity between ruler and ruled by allowing groups to vie for power in a way where they are not representing the common good, they are representing a particular interest, and they're going to take political power to have that interest dominate over all others. Instead, if we're going to have genuinely, properly political parties, they should be distinguished in having different political visions, different visions for how we're going to uphold the freedoms of everyone. That doesn't mean we don't allow there to be a sphere in which we can pursue our particular interests. and engage in labor organizing, for example, to promote the interests of workers in opposition to the interests of employers. Although obviously there's an interdependence between the two. So at some point, you can have the ruin of both if you don't know what you're doing. So I think it's important to keep these distinctions in mind, I think, which are often left behind. And of course, there are many people who take the view that politics or the state is just an instrument of power. And this you find on all sides of the political spectrum. You know, Max Weber regarded the state as just an institution of power. It has no ends of itself. It just has a monopoly of coercion, and it can be used by whatever force wants to impose its will upon everyone else. Lenin took that view, of course. And for that reason, Marx will take the view, at least in some of his early writings, that the state is ultimately just an instrument of class interest. And when we get rid of a plurality of classes and everyone becomes a proletariat, we no longer need a state. It can wither away. And then we get rid of the necessity of economic activity with complete automation. And what are we left with? Well, we're sort of left with our private hobby-like existence that you get when you have universal basic income, with the resources to just sort of get by, not have access to much of anything else. And someone else is providing the wealth that allows you to do that. So I think we want to keep in mind, I think it's crucial if we want to think about political freedom and democracy, that we recognize that we have to think of politics as always be concerned with ordering the whole and the common good, while in society, there we have a place where we have to assert the equal opportunity of all interests and fight the way in which a market that is left to its own designs ends up enforcing the domination of employers over everyone else. And that, of course, can creep into the political domain as it does today, when we allow money to gain disproportionate influence in politics.
Thanks, Richard. If I may,
Yeah.
I think we want to move on here. Brooke, you have a question, so we will move to you now. Thanks.
Yeah, my question might seem a little redundant after your answer, because I think you did address some of the things that this question will bring out. But you mentioned during your talk that there are these various and competing definitions of freedom. And Irami at the beginning kind of mentioned that a lot of people aren't really on board with this robust notion of freedom. And so I'm just kind of wondering how, or if you could explain more clearly how you see the idea of self-determination as leading necessarily to a robust notion of freedom, or how you might respond to someone who says or insists that freedom is, you know, nothing but sort of this notion of non-interference.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, we are now in a perfect storm for people to have a wake-up call on how this impoverished view of freedom is unacceptable and unviable. And, you know, we see it in the fact that more and more people are finding themselves threatened by a lack of any kind of economic security, as well as any ability to maintain their family relations and their family welfare. And that is not because property relations are not being observed. And it's not because we have a government that is not upholding property as people have it. It's because no one is taking care of you know, the catastrophic unemployment people are facing, the catastrophes of imminent evictions and foreclosures, you know, the catastrophes of not being able to pay for healthcare that you need now more desperately than ever, the catastrophes of not being able to have any affordable daycare for children or elders. And now we're in a situation where more and more people, because of the pandemic, find in some places like Athens, Georgia, that the schools are doing online teaching. But if you're going to work, who's going to look after your children, or let alone elders who need care, et cetera? So I think it's becoming, we're in a situation where one can point out that the pursuit of happiness or even one's very life and liberty are really in jeopardy unless we expand our notion of freedom. And that we can't really participate as citizens if we're homeless, if we're sick and dying, if we don't have any money. We just can't function politically. And of course, one aspect of that I partially experienced, not that I'm impoverished, but as a state employee, I'm required by law to go on unpaid leave when I run for office, and the university is not paying for my benefits. Well, if you think about it, you can recognize that in our society where, contrary to popular belief, not everyone can be an entrepreneur, and small businesses are not what dominate our economy, that more than 90% of us are employees. You can't exercise your right to run for office if it's a serious campaign, because you have to give up your job, which means no income, no benefits. And for most people, unlike tenured professors, there's no job awaiting you at the end of the campaign. If people think about that, they'll see that freedoms they take for granted are simply not there. They are undermined by the fact that we have not widened the account of freedom. And I think that sort of solves a problem that haunted liberal theory. And that was a problem I alluded to, where if you think of the state as being an instrument to uphold our private liberties, so to speak, our person and property, it's a means to an end, and that always leaves open that maybe it's not going to fulfill its end. If you think of self-government as being something that is valid in itself because it's a realization of freedom, and if you recognize that political freedom cannot be wielded by citizens unless their other freedoms are upheld. And why not? Because if you're not free in society or at home, you can't participate in politics on a par with others. So simply to be a genuinely self-governing citizen, you also have to have equal opportunity in society and at home. They all go together. And that means there is no real possibility for a genuine democracy to fail to do its duty of upholding our other non-political freedoms. They all fit together into a kind of systematic whole. And I think it's not that hard to make that clear. And I think the experiences of people, in a sense, reinforce that. Because we're seeing what happens to you when these other freedoms are not recognized. Now, of course, not everyone is pointing things like this out, but now more than ever, it could be pointed out. And of course, this is not just in the United States, it's worldwide. People are in distress in most countries to a degree they haven't been. And both their health and their livelihoods, and in connection with this, their freedoms are at stake, because all the economic anxiety that's being produced is just exacerbating the fueling of this anti-democratic nationalism that authoritarian populists like Donald Trump and his counterparts, I would say Bolsonaro is another in Brazil, Modi in India. I'm right. These obviously are huge, important countries. And most other countries where you have democracy, there are similar movements. They may not have taken power yet, but they're waiting in the wings. And I think we have to recognize the gravity of the situation.
I think Army has to go, so thanks for participating.
Thanks for having me. This was fantastic, and good luck.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Bye. Okay. Either Nastasia or Michael want to chime in? It's okay if you don't. I just want to give you all a chance to ask a question. Nastasia?
So you said, Richard, that Brazil and US are facing similar struggles, and I think we are in very different positions. We are not in similar situations. So first, Brazil has a much stronger agenda on social rights from since 1930s. We do have family paid leave.
Yep.
We do have a free healthcare system, public healthcare system. We do have public education. In the last analysis of education in Brazil, the best universities have been federal public universities, federally funded. Private universities are seen as enterprises that are looking for, money, whereas it is of interest of the state and of public servants to, like I am, of offering high quality, free, universal public education. Same for those who work at hospitals and work on the healthcare system. And what I think that this difference tells us, it tells us a lot of things. It tells us about the way that Brazilian citizens see themselves as part of a community, the way they see themselves as sharing a history of pain and of colonization. But it also tells us about, so in telling about our history of colonization, it tells us about our capacity of international self-determination, our capacity of self-determination facing international forces. So some of our former politicians thought that we should care for our own citizens and provide for them so that we'll have a healthier community, a healthier society. But it also tells us about the way that Americans see themselves as citizens. So when I compare those two experiences, being a citizen in Brazil, being an immigrant in the United States, and seeing the political experience of Americans, what I see, if you all may, very respectfully, is Americans fight for their freedom, but they're actually, so Etienne Laboetis saying, right? They think that they're fighting for their freedom, but they are enslaving themselves. Enslaving themselves where? In their own particular individual selves, where this notion of being a subject that does not suffer interference of anyone or anything just puts them in a position where they cannot fight collectively because they don't feel engaged, they don't have any connection, affective, spiritual, social, political, whatever, economical, with others. So it becomes, for immigrants at least, a culture of autonomy that is very similar to a sort of a tyranny of money, tyranny of desire, tyranny of wants, where in which if you do not have whatever you desire or you don't want, you become a lesser citizen, you become a lesser person at the end. So I would say that if we think of freedom in this sense, there's just absolutely no possible sense of self-determination. There's no possible sense of self-determination in the realm of politics if we think of the self as a subject that is independent, not tied, not constructed by someone else's history, someone else's desire. I mean, each and every person came into being because of the desire of others. So our own desire, our own existence is defined or has come into being because of others, right? Because of the will of others. I think that I'll try to be brief now to allow you to comment on that. But I think that this sense of individuality, noxious individuality, this excess of individualism and some sort of solipsism leads people to feel disconnected from politics. So I think that's a key feature because people are just interested in buying whatever will fulfill their immediate desire and, I don't know, travel here and there and live the American dream, right? Have their house and etc. And they don't feel connected. They don't feel responsibility for the life of others, for how the others actually influence in their own well-being. So I wonder whether fighting for this kind of self-determination actually is empty, will not lead to this sort of political change that you're envisioning. So my question is more like, is it possible? Is it desirable to like think in terms of relationality and other kinds of selfhood relationships, and I don't know, create a different sort of culture of freedom by stimulating the political imagination of people and showing actually that we are all bound in, we are all, you know, navigating the same boat and the same like tempestuous seas and etc.
I mean, I think what you say, you know, is very true, in that the United States has this pernicious exceptionalism where it has this very impoverished view of freedom. And that's reflected both domestically in this idea of rugged individualism. That means I have my property and I want to protect it. And that's to a large extent my relationship to everyone else. It's almost like accepting what prevailed under the Roman emperors, where a certain degree of property of the Roman citizen was respected, but everything else was left to the arbitrariness of the emperor. And you know, that's what happens when you just have this individualistic freedom being acknowledged. And you know, we see it in the fact that we lack, you know, what you were just mentioning, which has been adopted by most other nations, namely free higher education with stipends, public guaranteed healthcare, all sorts of paid leave, and other measures that are non-existent in our country. Even though we have signed on to the International Declaration of Human Rights, in which all of these things are laid out as matters that almost all the world has signed on to. And obviously that reflects how we regard the rest of the world. You know, with someone like Trump following in a long tradition of America first, where we don't regard our welfare as having anything to do with other countries whatsoever. And I think the way the pandemic has hit us sort of exemplifies all of this. And you see it on display here in Athens, as you would if you were back here, in the degree of people who don't give a damn about taking any precautions whatsoever and feel fairly invincible and could care less about anyone else's health. They don't want to wear masks, which is not an issue in most other countries, but here it is. They don't want to engage in social distancing. They don't want to shut down anything. Of course, if you're going to shut down, you have to provide benefits to everyone so they can retain their livelihood and the like. And of course, the idea is we don't give a damn about what's happening with other countries. We'll develop our own vaccine. We'll give it to our own citizens, and to hell with the rest of the world. And I think we're paying dearly for that. As we're paying dearly from the effects of the economic collapse that we've imposed upon ourselves by not taking proper precautions. So I think it is a wake-up call, you know, to come to grips with the deficiency of this ideal of this kind of restricted, privatized, egotistical freedom that you're referring to, which is so prevalent. I don't think it's the only thing that is there. I mean, there are people who want to extend our freedoms. That's what my agenda is about. Obviously, I don't have huge popular support. People don't know about it, and not many other political figures who are putting this kind of thing out there. But you know, the time is right now more than ever. And you know, in this sense, we can learn from the world. And I think in all countries, you know, we are facing. I mean, it's interesting to ask, you know, whether someone like Bolsonaro really has any objection to the things you're speaking about. Because, for example, Margaret Thatcher never got rid of the National Health Service in England. She never got rid of free higher education, although she restricted budgets to institutions of higher learning in Britain. And now they're beginning to have tuition to some degree. But it's interesting that in many, many other countries, even those on the right are not willing to forego this sense of social solidarity. which is so alien to so many people in America, I think, as you rightly point out.
Thank you, Anastasia, Richard. So it's 10:55. Sujata has recommended that we go a little over. Is it possible for people to stay 15 extra minutes, or is that not feasible for everybody? Is about 15 extra minutes okay?
I have to give food to my child.
Oh, of course.
It's time right now, but it's okay. 10 minutes. I think it's fine. 5 minutes after 12.
Okay, excellent. And if you have to leave a little early, that's okay. Maybe we'll try to finish up soon. Okay.
This brings back some days of graduate seminar of going over.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Michael, you haven't had a chance to ask a question. I thought I'd just give you the floor if you have anything you wanted to add or comments or questions before we finish.
Well, as you guys know, I always have questions. So this is a question that has been bothering me for a while, at least for the last 4 years, and that pertains to carrying philosophy into practice, returning to this line. So I recently looking, at the voting preferences, the different US demographics, I saw there's only one, even sizable demographic in this country, which is unabashedly and overwhelmingly, in fact, supports Trump, and that's white man with no college degree. Now, we have seen it throughout the history of the 20th century, and perhaps beyond that similar demographics are most susceptible to fascism and other, ideologies similar in one important aspect. You can remember Russian communism, religious ideologies of the past crusades. Paradoxically, also the demographic which benefits the most from proposals like Richard's, right? This is the demographic that cannot afford much of other demographics can afford this that way. And however, again, paradoxically, is the demographic to which is the hardest to sell the ideas of, for example, richer notion of freedom, the idea of social rights in general and stuff. And at times I think that the reason is perhaps less philosophical and more psychological. What we are trying to sell them is, in a sense, toil and trouble, a society which is more complex than we have now, a society where you have to act as a citizen, which is sort of a second job in a sense, right? As opposed to a fascist who sells them a dream, a wonderful dream, in fact, right? The fascist ideology makes you grow wings. You're suddenly not just, Joe Schmo. You're part of a greater whole, and that's a wonderful whole, and you don't need to do anything for that. You are born into this privileged group. So my question here is, and I genuinely have no idea of an answer, how we can, in a sense, using our regular arguments, using reason, to try and convince this demographic that there is another better way.
I mean, I think a key part of it is jobs. And I think what one finds in many nations in which you have such movements operating is you have, even in social democratic nations that have free higher education, essentially free healthcare, and a very strong safety net, they still accept unemployment. They may have very generous unemployment benefits, but there still is unemployment. There's no guarantee of employment. And many of these countries, particularly the more affluent ones, are being inundated by refugees from all over the world, for obvious reasons. And a certain segment of the population have been suffering, let's say, growing economic difficulties because of certain declines in manufacturing and other things. That it's possible for people to villainize these others as likely sources of their own economic insecurity. And in the case of the United States, you have the various triumphs of civil rights movements, which have been empowering other groups in certain respects, but in no way improving the economic insecurity of, for example, the white working class, as there continues to be this decline in real wages, and particularly as a percentage of our national wealth, and increasing prices for everything you need, from education to healthcare to housing, et cetera. So I think if one eliminates joblessness and poverty income and makes clear how we can do that by government stepping in and offering jobs, that is something that actually can be understood as dealing with what this group feels lacking in what in the United States the Democratic Party has been offering, which has not been offering guaranteed jobs, and to be susceptible to Republican politicians like Donald Trump who say we're going to bring jobs back to America. Well, they're not bringing guaranteed employment. But I think this is something that actually, according to polls, is supported by 61% of Georgians, except they don't know about it much. The pollster may tell them about it, but they haven't heard about this. So I think particularly now, it's possible if one addresses these kind of issues to get through to them, potentially. Because right now they regard, for example, the Democratic Party as something that is an elitist organization that doesn't do anything really for workers, that's only concerned with the interests of non-whites and is favoring them in various ways through affirmative action and things of that sort. And they regard themselves as being the neglected part of the population. So I think this social rights agenda has something to offer if it's made clear. Remember, rights apply to everyone. And I think that's an important part of presenting it in that way. Not operating in terms of need qualifications, but these should be things that are available to all, just as our public schools are available to all, whether or not you could pay or not pay for certain public educational services. Now, I think that is one way of trying to make a wedge. And I think, again, we're in a situation where if that's not done, this group is going to be more drawn to this anti-democratic nationalism. And perhaps we see that happening. I'm not saying that's easy, and unfortunately, I don't think it's being done that effectively by most other political agents in this electoral cycle, for example.
Thanks, Richard. I've just heard again from Sujata, who's encouraging me to just continue the discussion until well, around 11:30. So I've been given these instructions. So if at any point people want to drop out or need to go, of course, please just do it. I don't know.
So I do
how
have
many.
to get off.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and jump off. I have a couple things to prepare for, but this is great. I appreciated the invitation to come on and to talk with all of you, to see all of you again, and to I'll talk on Richard. I'll take you, Richard, a hard time, as we all should. But no, this was great, and be sure to vote if you haven't already.
Thanks, Joey. Thanks for participating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bye. See you soon.
Greg, I'm afraid I'll have to leave as well because and I have to feed him. So thank you again. I do think that it's beautiful and important to see those this political agenda being put forward, and it's nice to see people discussing it. I think that regardless of the result, it has already brought many benefits to at least the Georgians and American people and those who have been following your campaign, Richard. So best of luck, and count on me, whatever else you need, okay? I'm here to give you more hard time.
Well, thank you for your comments. I think they're very important. And
Yeah.
we Americans have to listen to them very seriously.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
we drag down the rest of the world into our
There's a lot to be said about that. It's a very interesting topic because, on the other hand, Brazil is a third world country. It's an underdeveloped country. So I imagine that American people are thinking, we don't want to be like Brazil, just like Brazilians when the left claim for a larger social agenda. Using Bolivia's example, they say, we don't want to be like Bolivia, go to Bolivia, go to Cuba, right? So it's not about that, right? It's about learning from the mistakes and what other countries have done right. We, for example, do not have a case where you have to sell your house to undergo cancer treatment, right? Or you don't have to I don't know, use all your money, everything that you have left for your work to put your son in college. So we have the opportunity. And this, what is most important, I think, in all this matter is to say that this is of interest of the whole Brazilian society, not to have people that are uneducated and not to have people dying from diseases that we know how to cure and that we have the resources to do it without, making medicine like a only a source of profit and income, but think of medicine and health as a humanistic enterprise as well that is of interest of everybody. So there's a lot to talk about that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to start this talk, and I hope that in the future we can share more.
Great.
Thank you, Nastasia.
Thanks for participating.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
So I hope it's okay that I take a moment to ask a question myself, maybe two questions, since I've been effacing my own self for the sake of the others here. But so I'd like to bring the discussion maybe back to a more theoretical level for a little while.
Yeah.
And of course, this will have implications for thinking practically as well. But of course, Richard, you've advocated for a philosophy of right that is freed from foundations. And in particular, the good ought not be grounded on an appeal to any given privileged authorities, whether it be the content of willing, such as a particular end given in advance of willing, or a privileged form or agency of the will. If the philosophy of right, the practical philosophy of freedom, ought to give up on any appeal to any privileged authorities given in advance, it appears as though ethics ought to proceed without any given authority. And if this is the case, what I want to know, what I'd like for you to talk more about is, what is problematic about anarchism? Anarchism, a tradition skeptical of authority and hierarchy. Why ought we not endorse a kind of anarchism in ethics or political philosophy and the various forms of ethical community, rather than reform the state, for example? What would be problematic about a foundation-free political philosophy that denies the legitimacy of the state altogether? So there's one of the more well-known kind of and respected kind of anarchist anthropologist, David Graeber, just recently died, and there's been a lot of his work that's been passed around. So I thought that I would ask you. I don't remember that I don't know if you've directly addressed this issue in your books, or if you've indirectly addressed the question of anarchism. And maybe on a broader scale, I'd like for you to speak to, are there other forms of foundation-free practical philosophy other than Hegel's that Hegel's would stand in competition with? Because I think in your essay, World Spirit on the Campaign Trail in Georgia, you say that with the exception, almost all thinkers subscribe to foundational justification. So I'm wondering about that almost there. And would anarchism, for example, or certain forms of it count as, say, forms of political philosophy and organization that reject foundations? So thanks.
I mean, at a minimum, I think all brands of anarchism reject the state as something that is essential to the reality of freedom. And I think what a part of that rejection consists in failing to recognize how the state and the other institutions of free community, such as a civil society and a family that has been constituted as a private relationship whose participants act autonomously and in co-determining their family life. They fail to recognize that these exercises of household, social, and political autonomy can only be engaged in within the existing presence of these institutions. You can't exercise, obviously, political freedom if there isn't a democratic state to belong to. The same thing with regard to society. You can't exercise your social freedoms unless you have a society which has the kind of interactions in which domination is overcome. And the same thing within a family. You can't exercise spousal freedom if conjugal relations involve either patriarchal, matriarchal, or whatever other kind of heterosexual domination in one form or another. So part of the anarchist creed is a failure to recognize that there are freedoms that are inseparable from institutions of a certain character. And then what they also ignore is how a free state is absolutely crucial for the sustenance of any other forms of freedom. I mean, the most minimal form of freedom is that, I think, of what's involved in determining oneself as an owner. Because if you can't determine your existence as the recognized owner of your own body, you're tantamount to a slave. And nothing you do will count as your own. But the relation of property owners does not of itself give us the resources to sustain our property relations, right? No one has any particular authority to determine where the boundaries of ownership lie, what wrongs are, how they should be remedied, and so forth. You know, you obviously need something more than that. Of course, we also are going to be facing household relations. And unless these are reconstituted as relations in which various kinds of hierarchies are removed, they're going to be obstacles to even having our property rights recognized, right? And we've seen, of course, how that has occurred under patriarchal conditions. And then on the other hand, you need civil law, but also economic relations that remove economic submission if you're going to be free, as an anarchist would like to be. But then all of these institutions cannot themselves maintain their reality unless you have a state, sustaining them, giving them the resources they need, protecting them, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't be a member of a democratic state unless your other freedoms are maintained.
Right. And
so anarchism ignores these things. And on the other hand, if it's taken to extreme, what do you have? You have this extremely impoverished notion of freedom, as if it could, first of all, exist independently and be free of domination without other institutions of freedom being at hand. And I think that's the big problem with anarchism, however it be formulated.
Thanks. Yeah, and so the need for the state also indicates that this concept of freedom, this enriched concept of freedom that you're talking about, also requires the threat of coercion, right?
Well, remember, when you talk about coercion, you're coercing actions that are violations of right.
Yeah.
And in that way, you're respecting the autonomy of the individuals concerned.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, you don't punish anyone unless you recognize that they are autonomous and responsible for what they're doing and for willing against right. Mm-hmm. And you're still respecting their agency as a person, moral subject, et cetera, et cetera. You're not depriving them of their family relations or their social position, nor should you be depriving them of the right to vote, as we do in America. In most places, you know, when you're convicted, you lose your right to vote.
Thanks. I also have maybe one brief follow-up question. Well, it's not really about anarchism, but it's about identity politics.
Yeah.
And I was hoping that you could say something about how you understand identity politics and its relation to your politics of freedom. I mean, you mentioned briefly this problem that arises when we conflate civil society that's pursuing particular interests with the universal aims of the body politic, right? In your essay on the world spirit on the campaign trail, you talk about one reason why you think that you lost your attempt to run for Congress in the 10th congressional district. And this was, I think you had commented that identity trumped over policy.
Yeah.
In the absence of exposure to candidate programs.
Yeah.
So what I'm interested is, in what way do you see that the philosophy of right in your rejuvenated and revised vision of the philosophy of right and how you intend to apply it to our situation today? How is that in a certain way inconsistent with or incompatible with identity politics as you understand it?
Yeah.
Or is there a way in which it's compatible with it? How do you understand it? So I hope that you could give voice to this, this very I mean, of course, Hegel's not talking about identity politics so much. So I was hoping that you could say something about it.
I mean, you have two kinds of identity politics. One is, I think, outright fascism, which takes a particular identity that is not an identity you have determined yourself to be. It's an identity you have by birth, being part of a specific ethnic group, a race, a people as an historically given cultural entity. It could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, whatever. And that that privileges you in your relationships to others and disadvantages everyone else. And in a sense, it's in reaction to that you have another kind of remedial identity politics, where people in groups who have been underprivileged because of their identity are seeking to have that disadvantage remedied by, well, something like an affirmative action, where one is going to make their identity as a group that has been discriminated against because of their identity. We're going to try to counteract the ramifications of that past discrimination, if it has been overcome, by giving you special advantages of various sorts, where it could be access to jobs, or access to political office, or various other things. Now, the country that has done this on the widest scale is actually India, which has had a huge affirmative action program for many years. And it's not referring to affirmative action of people owing to racial differences. It's rather differences that are intra-racial, that is, they're differences of caste, to some degree of religion, and to some degree of being part of tribal communities. People in various groups in the lower castes, et cetera, are given, there are quotas in effect. That includes university, hiring, admissions, and so forth. And it's thought that two things are required to remove the historical aftermath of discriminatory identity politics, that is, underprivileged groups. On the one hand, you have to now have rights recognized as applying to everyone, but then you have to add to it affirmative action. And you put the two together, and that's going to solve the problem. That's going to remove the heritage and really achieve equal opportunity. But the problem is affirmative action as a form of this kind of remedial identity politics doesn't remove the past ramifications, the social disadvantages that persist. Because first of all, it only applies to a very small group of new openings, be they in terms of jobs or political office. It doesn't affect the great mass of people from these groups who are already employed and so forth. It has nothing to do with whether there will be sufficient jobs, positions available for everyone. It says nothing about what the wages and so forth will be. And it says nothing about all the other benefits one needs to be able to overcome the results of past discriminations. In other words, we have in our country a systemic racism and a systemic sexism consisting in two things. Owing to the fact that we had legal discrimination against people of color and women in particular, there is a very significant wage and wealth gap between white and black and between men and women. African Americans make about 2/3 of what the average white person makes. The median African American family has maybe 1/10 the wealth of a white family. Women make 4/5 of what men make. A woman has 1/3 the wealth of a man in America. Well, affirmative action does not remove the impact of these differences, because there's also something else at hand, namely access to healthcare, to education, to decent housing, to legal representation. All these things in America depends upon how much wealth and income you have. So as a result, the disadvantages that have been wrought by past identity politics that officially discriminated against people are enabled to be perpetuated and deepened despite affirmative action. And I think that failure of affirmative action has led to, in a way, a kind of rebirth of racist feeling and sexist feeling on those groups who feel they are disadvantaged because they presume that the playing field has actually been leveled, and now these other groups are being given advantages which they don't share. And they find their economic circumstances not what they should be. And I think that has fostered a degree of resentment. And then there's the other factor that the beneficiaries of affirmative action often are stuck with a question over their heads about whether they were really qualified for what they got, or is it simply a matter of their identity? And I think the true remedy to the systemic racism, systemic sexism is to have all of our social rights fulfilled and to eliminate joblessness and poverty income. So that, in a way, you could say, we lift the boot of history off everyone's backs. We nullify the impact of past discrimination. And I think identity politics, unfortunately, doesn't do that. It just presents a remedy that's a false remedy. And it encourages a rise in a kind of resentment, an anti-democratic resentment that is pernicious. And I think it's something that this election, there's also a certain amount of that I think affected my campaign, in that I did not get support from certain so-called progressive groups. And I think part of it was that I'm an old white male. I don't have the proper identity to some degree, even if my policies, were by far more in line with what they stood for than anyone else. But I think that is falsely looked upon as a factor to be taken into consideration. And I think it's pernicious. You don't want what you are by nature, what you are by birth, right, to have impact upon your relations to others. And if you do, you are, in a way, striking at freedom, because you're not allowing what you determine yourself to be what matters, as regards to that part of your identity that you have not determined, but is just given.
Thanks, Richard. We could keep going on. I'm very interested in pursuing this conversation further, but it's getting late. I wanted to ask if Brooke, Emre, or Michael had any final words that they'd like to say, or any final questions that they'd like to address before we shut it down tonight, or this morning. Sorry, I forget. Some of you were in Germany, some of you are in America, some of you, here I am in Asia. It's getting late for me, close to midnight here.
Well, it was certainly very interesting, and good luck to us all in a couple of weeks.
We'll see. We'll see how respectable a showing I make.
Well, I was actually curious because we've kind of stayed in the realm of human affairs, how you do connect all of this to a responsibility to the natural environment. And is it just sort of, is the responsibility simply grounded in, well, we need an earth in which to enact our self-determination, or is there more to it that would underlie a responsibility to the natural world?
Well, I do think what you just referred to, namely ensuring that we have the natural conditions to exercise our freedom, itself is the basis of a very radical environmental politics. I mean, we haven't yet discussed it, but it is part of what I think is a fundamental social right. You know, if you have a right to freedoms, you also have a right to the conditions that make those freedoms possible. And we can't exercise any of our freedoms if human life is no longer possible on this planet. And we are at the point where, global warming that is a result of human activity is coming close to a point of no return, which not only can do tremendous damage to many communities in many different localities of the world, but could lead to all sorts of, self-reinforcing mechanisms that will push things to a point of no return. And that's why I think we do have to take the idea of a decisive Green New Deal seriously, where we do really set a goal. I think it should be within 10 years to eliminate any further fossil fuel emissions. And it's feasible, we can do it. The New Deal part of it is we have to ensure that everyone's livelihood is supported, because we have to shut down most of the fossil fuel industry. Now, I don't think we have to attribute to nature any rights of its own. And I think it becomes problematic to do so, because you really can't attribute rights to anything but other agents, because with rights goes duties. I mean, if you have a right, that means that you recognize yourself to have a range of choice that you can exercise in conjunction with everyone else being able to do the same. And that means you have to curtail your range of choices so it doesn't intrude on the rights of others. So if I'm gonna have a right to property, I have to respect your property. If I have a right to vote, I have to respect your right to vote, etc. Well, entities that are not agents are not in a position to do that. But I don't think that in any way diminishes our need to protect the environment, because we do need to protect the environment in order to maintain conditions that allow us to be free. And I think that involves not only curtailing global warming, but ensuring that there is a sufficient diversity of species to also allow us to maintain ourselves. And, I think that is enough to have just as strong a pro-environment position as anything that involves ascribing what I think can't be done coherently, rights to non-rational entities. But I think it is an essential thing. Just as health is a fundamental human right, because you can't function if you don't have health. But we can't function unless we have a livable environment. And that is a fundamental human right. And that is also something that has to go beyond American individualism. Not only that we not only care for everyone in this society, because we're talking about the globe, I mean, our territory, but also the globe. I mean, it's obviously an international matter, because we can't halt the degradation of the planet just by doing things within our own territory. And in that respect, as in many others, the fulfillment of our rights depends upon the fulfillment of the rights of everyone on the planet.
Okay, thank you so much, Brooke, for that question, and Richard for your response. I think we should probably wrap it up here.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I myself have to run, I think. And
Sure.
I think, Richard, you have a very full day ahead of you, we understand.
I do actually.
Yeah, I think I speak for everybody when I say that we're all proud to have been your students, and we've certainly learned a lot from you. So unlike your colleagues, you have taught us something. And we wish you the best of luck in the campaign, and we'll be rooting for you. So
Thank you.
thanks for having the discussion, everybody. And thanks, Richard, for taking the time to do it.
Now, I just want to say that I expect all of you to commit what philosophers always do. That is, you commit parricide or matricide, as the case may be. Because at some point you have to recognize some kind of shortcomings in the people you may have learned from, if you're going to set out on your own. And I look forward to that in the years to come.
Okay, we'll take that as a challenge and as an invitation to disagree. Okay. Thanks a lot. And Richard, I think you're the host, so I think you're in charge of ending the meeting. So,
well, thanks all of you for attending. It's good to see you again. And
Thank you.
Best of luck in all your endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care.
have a good day. Bye-bye.